Welcome to the Deep Dive, and thanks for tuning in. If you're looking to really get behind the headlines on big global issues, well, you're in the right place.
That's what we aim for.
So today we're jumping into something that sounds maybe a little dry on the surface, U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods.
Right. We're using a really interesting discussion from a Busca podcast as our base. Their piece, Tariffs dos EUA contra a China Ekingem 145%, gives us a lot to unpack.
Yeah, and tariffs, the word itself, maybe not the most exciting.
Probably not for most people.
Yeah.
But, as we looked into it, there are some real twists here. And crucially, it connects directly to, your wallet, the prices you pay.
Exactly. That's the core of it. So our mission for this deep dive, using the insights from a Busca podcast and a G1 report they mentioned, is to sort of map out the history, the reasons behind these tariffs, and what the fallout might be for you.
Okay, let's get started then. Where does the story really begin?
Well, from what we gathered, the initial spark, you could say, was when then-President Donald Trump started announcing these increased taxes, these tariffs on stuff coming into the U.S. from China.
And that's when the term trade war started getting thrown around a lot.
Right, which I think for a lot of us at the time felt kind of abstract.
Yeah.
Like something governments were doing way over there.
Definitely. It seems like high-level politics, maybe big business stuff. But as a Busca podcast highlighted, this was really just the opening move.
And maybe we should quickly clarify, a tariff, basically it's just a tax, right? A tax on imported goods to make them more expensive.
Precisely. It's a tool governments use. And in this case, the numbers involved started to climb, pretty dramatically.
Yeah, the White House confirmed it reached, 145% on some Chinese goods? That figure is just staggering.
It really is. Think about that. A tax that more than doubles the cost of something just because it crossed a border. You immediately see how that could shake things up for businesses.
And for consumers paying the final price.
Exactly. But it wasn't like flipping a switch to 145%. The G1 report laid out how it was more like a series of steps and escalation.
Like a snowball effect. Or maybe, as a Busca podcast put it, like a chess game.
Yeah, or a tug of war. Each move by one side seemed to provoke a counter move from the other. It was very back and forth.
So it kicked off back in February. This was the initial extra 10% tariff on Chinese imports.
Right. And it's worth remembering, there were likely some existing tariffs already, so this 10% increase pushed the total to 20%. Not insignificant.
Definitely not. It was an early sign things were getting tense.
Then, around April 2nd, things really escalated. Trump announced what he called reciprocal tariffs.
Reciprocal meaning like tit for tat.
Pretty much, an eye for an eye kind of thing. He added another 34% tariff on Chinese goods.
Okay, so now we're at the original tariff plus this 34%, putting the total at 54%.
You got a big jump. And these reciprocal tariffs are basically saying, you hit us, we hit you back.
And China's response, they weren't just going to take that, were they?
No, not at all. They retaliated pretty quickly, slapped their own 34% tariffs on American goods going into China.
So the tug of war was definitely on. Back and forth.
Absolutely. And it didn't stop there. The U.S. then upped the ante again. Another 50% increase on their side.
Wow. Okay, so 54% plus another 50%. That gets us to 104%.
That's right, 104%. Imagine being a company relying on imports from China and suddenly facing that kind of cost increase.
Yeah, that changes your entire business model potentially, and China's move after that.
Well, China then signaled, they didn't implement it immediately, maybe, but they signaled they were planning an 84% increase on their side.
Okay, so the numbers just keep climbing. It feels relentless.
It really does. And then the U.S. made another move, increasing those reciprocal tariffs again, this time up to 125%.
Right, and just to be super clear, like the White House and a Busca podcast pointed out, this 125% gets added to that original 20% tariff from way back in February.
Exactly. And that's how you land at that headline grabbing 145% total for certain Chinese goods. It really paints a picture of just how intense this trade fight got and how quickly.
Okay, so these are massive numbers, huge actions. What was the official reasoning? Why do this?
Well, according to the G1 report referenced by the podcast, the justification given by Trump centered on this idea of a lack of respect from China towards world markets.
A lack of respect. What does it mean in practice?
The narrative put forward was essentially that China was exploiting the U.S. in trade, maybe not playing fair, and that this situation was China's fault.
So the argument was these tariffs were necessary to level the playing field, force China to change its ways.
That seems to be the underlying message. It taps into longer-running debates about trade imbalances, intellectual property, market access, all those complex issues. The tariffs were presented as a tool to address those grievances.
But then there was that weird twist, wasn't there? Where Trump announced a temporary tariff cut.
Ah, yes, that was interesting. He announced a reduction back down to 10%, but only for 90 days, and specifically for countries that didn't retaliate against the U.S.
That sounds strategic. Maybe trying to split off allies from China.
It could certainly be read that way. A tactic to isolate Beijing, maybe put pressure on them by rewarding others who stayed out of the direct fight. Or maybe just a temporary pause to see what happened. It's hard to know the exact motive.
It definitely adds another layer. And then there's the other curious part.
Which is?
Despite all this economic conflict, these sky-high tariffs, Trump apparently kept calling China's leader, Xi Jinping, a friend.
Yeah, that is quite the contrast, isn't it? Engaging in what looks like a pretty fierce trade war while trying to maintain some level of personal diplomacy.
It seems almost contradictory. How do you square that circle?
Well, international relations are complex, right? Sometimes personal leader-to-leader channels are kept open even when policies are clashing hard. Maybe it was a way to keep dialogue possible behind the scenes, or just the particular style of that administration. It's definitely noteworthy.
So, okay, the U.S. is justifying its actions this way, adding tariffs, offering temporary cuts. How did China officially react to all this?
Well, based on that G1 report and statements from China's Ministry of Commerce spokesperson Wang Wentao, their position was pretty firm.
Meaning they weren't backing down?
Not at all. Now, the report captures a specific moment, and at that exact point, they hadn't announced their full retaliation, perhaps, but the message was clear. Resolve. They weren't going to be pushed around.
What was their main argument against the U.S. actions?
They strongly criticized using tariffs like a weapon. They argued the U.S. approach was hurting the whole global trading system, not just China. And they kept coming back to the need for mutual respect as the starting point for any real conversation.
Mutual respect. That sounds like a baseline requirement for negotiation.
Exactly. And they were very clear they wouldn't be, quote, submissive. Wang Wentao's words, as reported, were quite strong.
Like what?
Things like China being willing to fight to the end, and that tactics like pressure, threats, and blackmail just wouldn't work on them.
Wow. Okay, so really digging in their heels. Strong language.
Very much so. It underlined their determination not to be seen as yielding under duress.
So, with both sides seemingly locked in this escalating conflict, this brings us back to the impact, right? The real-world consequences for people listening.
Precisely. Because this isn't just happening in government buildings. How does it actually affect you and me?
And this is where, as the podcast pointed out, it really hits home. Those increased costs from tariffs, they usually get passed down the line.
Right. When a company importing, say, electronics or furniture or clothes from China suddenly has to pay 50% or 100% more in taxes at the border.
They often have little choice but to raise the price they charge us for those things, right? To stay in business.
That's the most direct impact for consumers, yeah. Higher prices on imported goods, it creates this ripple effect.
And it's not just imports, is it? What about U.S. companies selling stuff to China?
Good point. They get hit by China's retaliatory tariffs. So American-made products become more expensive for Chinese buyers.
Like American farmers selling soybeans, for example.
Exactly. If their soybeans suddenly face an 84% tariff going into China, they become way less competitive against soybeans from, say, Brazil. That can mean lost sales, which hurts the farmers, the exporters, and potentially jobs here.
So it's a chain reaction. Higher costs for importers potentially lead to higher prices for us here, and difficulties for exporters trying to sell abroad.
It touches a lot of different parts of the economy, both domestically and globally. What starts as a bilateral trade dispute can have these really broad consequences.
Okay, so looking forward, what's the outlook? Where does this U.S.-China trade relationship go from here? Is there an end in sight, an agreement maybe?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Or maybe the billion-dollar question. It's really tough to say.
Because based on everything we've discussed, both sides seem pretty dug in, determined to defend their interests.
Exactly. It feels like a Busca podcast suggested, like we're still kind of in the middle of the story. An ongoing novel with chapters yet to be written.
So more developments are likely. This isn't closed book.
Seems unlikely. We'll probably keep seeing headlines and discussions about this relationship for a while. So
I guess the key thing for listeners to take away is that this huge escalation in U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods hitting that 145% on some items and the responses from China, It all has real weight.
Absolutely. It's not just political noise. It has direct and indirect impacts on, well, on your economic reality.
And even with all the complex politics and economics swirling around, it's important to remember that often it's the everyday consumer who ends up bearing a big chunk of the cost through those potentially higher prices.
That's a crucial point, which maybe leads to a final thought for people to chew on.
Go for it.
Well, thinking longer term, what are the deeper consequences of trade disputes like this one, especially at this scale, on our interconnected world? Beyond the immediate price hikes, what unseen effects might ripple out over time for global trade, for international cooperation?
Yeah, that's definitely something to consider.
Yeah.
What does this level of friction mean for the future of how countries deal with each other economically? It's a big, evolving question, and like you said, the story isn't over yet.